Sing hallelujah to our God. Glory, hallelujah is to our God. Every praise is to our God. Every praise is to our God. Every word of worship with one accord. Every praise is to our God. Sing hallelujah to our God. Glory, hallelujah is to our God. Every praise is to our God. God my Savior, God my healer, God my deliverer. Yes, He is. Yes, He is. God my Savior, God my healer, God my deliverer. Yes, He is. Yes, He is. Yes, He is. God my Savior, God my healer, God my deliverer. Yes, He is. Yes, He is. Yes, He is. Every praise is to our God. Every word of worship with one accord. Every praise is to our God. Sing hallelujah to our God. Glory, hallelujah is to our God. Every praise is to our God. When I'm down, Lord, you pick me up. Then I fall on my knees. When I'm dry, Lord, you fill my cup. You always give what I need, and yours, Lord, I'll always be. When everything's right, I will praise you. In seasons of joy, I will sing, and even in trials, I'll still praise you. For you are my glorious King. Yes, you are my glorious King. When I'm up and blessings abound, and your grace falls like rain. When your love and mercy surround, Lord, I will praise you again. My God, Redeemer and friend. When everything's right, I will praise you. In seasons of joy, I will sing, and even in trials, I'll still praise you. For you are my glorious King. Yes, you are my glorious King. You came for me in the form of a man, bearing my sins on a cross, taking the shame and fulfilling.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Wednesday evening Bible class. We are going to be studying from the book of Exodus. We are in class number 20 here, going to be talking about the covenant. If we were following the schedule, we would see that really we were supposed to talk about the covenant on Sunday, but we're going to go ahead and cover that today, and then we will combine those two classes, class number 20 and 21, those topics of instructions for the tabernacle and instructions for the priest. I believe we'll be able to cover all 4 chapters of that Exodus, chapters 25 through 29 there. I believe we'll be able to cover that all on Wednesday. So for those of you who were not able to watch the class Sunday or not attend here Sunday morning, let's just go ahead and do a quick review of where we were at. We started off by talking about the 10 Commandments and listing those 10 Commandments there and looking at how really each one of those 10 Commandments was meant to tell us something about God or to teach us some kind of lesson there. And then we moved on into the next 2.5 chapters there where we cover the various laws. And these various laws cover a wide gamut of topics. So just a few overall comments about those laws before we would move on. First and foremost, it is important for us to realize and to remember that the extra laws that were given there in the rest of chapter 20, 21, 22, and 23 were really extensions of those 10 Commandments. Those basic principles that we find inside the 10 Commandments, we really see that these laws provided some practical examples for how those principles were supposed to be lived out and how they were supposed to be carried out and executed by the judges of Israel here. And on Sunday, we presented this by going through those chapters and showing how each one of those laws did tie to a 10 Commandment. But instead, what I wanted to do tonight is just to emphasize that by showing you here that every single one of those 10 Commandments we can find repeated in some way, some very direct, some a little bit more obscure, but the same idea that we can find that repeated in those chapters, the rest of chapter 20, all the way up through the last portion of chapter 23 there. We talked then about how if these were extensions of the 10 Commandments, that they were meant to teach man accountability, that our consequences have actions, and even the lack of actions can have consequences. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. That our actions have consequences, and that even the lack of actions can also have consequences there. That man is expected to have responsibility. We have tasks that we have been given, and we are expected to live up to those. We are also expected to be responsible for ourselves and to care for others and to live up to the way that God would have us to be. We talked about how that these laws were really made to be applicable to the world as it is or as it was then. Not necessarily is God laying out, this is my perfect utopia, but instead understanding that man has fallen, sin has entered the world since the garden, that really, in fact, these laws were to govern the world as it was and to help the people of Israel to stand out from the nations around them, to give them a moral code and a moral compass to live by, but yet at the same time understanding that they were still in the world and that there were still a lot of problems even within the nation of Israel. We talked about how that they had just come out of slavery, but yet already they had slaves among them. And so how were they to treat those people and how was that to be carried out? We also talked about that some of these laws really have no context or no sense without the proper context. And we just don't have that context today. There are some of the laws and some of the wording especially that we find in here that really without understanding the context that they did, maybe even using their specific idioms and their specific language, that it really just doesn't make a lot of sense to us today. And that's okay, because it made sense to them, it helped govern their lives, and the things that we can glean from these commandments and from the laws about God and about how He expected His people to live, we can still understand those very clearly. Those lessons are not obscure. They're not using weird language. They're very straightforward there. So now we have followed the nation of Israel out of Egypt. They have left Egypt and wandered through the wilderness to Mount Sinai. They're here at the base of Mount Sinai, and God, and through Moses, has been delivering these laws to them. In fact, some of the laws, we know the Ten Commandments, he spoke directly to them from the mountain in a way that scared them to death, so they begged Moses, you talk to God, and then you talk to us, but please don't let God talk to us anymore. And some of the laws are pretty harsh, a lot of capital punishment, a lot of things that would prescribe consequences for their actions, and to help understand that justice really isn't merciful. True justice is exactly what you gave is what you're going to get. Of course, made most famous by what almost everybody in the world knows, even if they don't understand the context, is here from Exodus where it says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and it ends up being a life for a life, even though those exact words aren't spoken there. Still, God has put forward these laws, laid out how he wants his people to live, and he's not going to do that without offering some kind of reward. So beginning here right at the end of those laws, we can see here that God's going to give them a carrot to follow, a reason that they would want to obey these laws, to obey him, and to go ahead and live the kind of life that he is asking them to live. So he is going to then promise them Canaan, and he's going to present to them the rewards for obedience. And so I wanted to really start out here by reading this passage. There's just a few verses here. And so we're going to begin in chapter 23 and in verse 20. Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place which I have prepared. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. But if you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites and to the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I blot them out, you shall not bow down to their gods nor serve them, nor do as they do, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will take away sickness from among you. None shall miscarry or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. I will send my terror before you, and I will throw them into confusion, all the people against whom you shall come, and I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivites and the Canaanites and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little will I drive them out from Little by little will I drive them out from before you until you have increased and possessed the land. I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness of the Euphrates, for I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out from before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare unto you. So in this passage, God is preparing them for the next phase of the journey here. Now that they are going to be his people, they're going to be guided by these laws and these rules. What is the final reward? That reward is going to be the land that was promised unto Abraham and that they have been brought out of Egypt to go and to possess. Along the way, God promises that he will send a messenger to lead and protect them. And you notice I purposely changed that there from the word angel to the word messenger. Many of you know I don't particularly like that word angel, especially in the Old Testament, because the same word there is actually messenger. He promises them health, many children, that they will live out their full days, they will live out a long life. He will be fighting on their side against their enemies, and that he's going to deliver them a good land when they are ready for it. Instead of just moving into a completely abandoned and desolate land, instead he's going to drive out the current inhabitants as the children of Israel would expand so that the land doesn't grow fallow and turn against them. It says here, the wild beasts multiply against you. But basically, he wants them to take over a land that has been prepared and ready for them. There is an interesting point here that I do want to spend just a few moments about. Who is God sending in front of them? What do we know about this person or this being, this entity that God is going to be sending with them on their journey? In all of our modern translations, we see here that they are called an angel. Again, remember, this is really just the word messenger. Sometimes we get too hung up in that term of what we would visualize when we think of an angel. This is God's messenger who he is going to be sending before them. He is to be obeyed. He speaks with God's voice. Specifically, do not rebel against him. Do exactly as he says. Why? Because God said, my name is in him. And in many of your Bibles, depending on the translation that you're reading from, you'll see that that is italicized, meaning that it was 100% added by our translator so that that sentence would make sense in English. More literally, this phrase could have been translated, and maybe should have been, he has my name. He also wears the name of God. Not quite saying he is equal to God, but he is bearing the name of God within him. Of course, because of this and because of many other clues that we find in not only here but other places, many people believe that God is saying here he is going to be sending a very specific messenger, the personage of Jesus, the third member of the Godhead that we know as the Son of God from the New Testament, but that at this point he is not being called Jesus, not being called Messiah, but yet at the same time many people believe this is him who was there from clues that point to that, and we've talked about some of these already, and we'll talk about them more in classes to come. I don't want to spend a ton of time on that here. Along with this promise of someone to go with them and someone to protect them and lead them, and this great promise of the land, he also presents a warning here. And it's pretty interesting that he warns them twice about the same thing, about the inhabitants of the land first. When they go into the land, completely overthrow them. Don't act like they do. Don't do the kind of things that they currently are doing. Make no covenants with them. And in fact, don't even let them dwell in the land with you, because if you do, it's going to be trouble. Not only does he warn them about the inhabitants of the land, he also warns them about their gods. Don't be tempted and don't worship them. Don't bow down to them. Don't serve them or make covenants with them, with the gods of these people, because these both will be a snare to you. Obviously, if you leave the people in the land and you're living among them, they're going to try to convert you to worship their gods. And if you see that, you may be tempted. I don't really understand, of course. We've talked about this many times. God has just shown himself to be the God of gods, above all of the gods of the earth. But yet they are going to be tempted to fall down and to worship the gods of the people in the land that they are going to possess. Specifically here, God warns them, they will make you sin against me. You will fall into that temptation. And of course, one of the things that we know is that they do that many, many times over and over again, despite his chastisement, until eventually he will take them away from the land that he has given them. Then we get to chapter 24, and the first time we are going to see a covenant made between man and God. So we're going to see here the actual covenant being ordained, being put into place, being sealed on both parties. And this is important because this is the first mutual covenant that we find in the Bible. Previously, it had been God making covenants with people that he had chosen. He chose Noah. He chose Abraham. He chose Moses. And those people weren't given a whole lot of choice in what they were going to do. And obviously, Noah chose to serve God and to build the ark as he was requested, and Abraham chose to follow God and to leave the land of his birth, like God had asked him to do. But still, they weren't exactly presented a lot of options of, do you agree or not? God had chosen them for a very specific purpose. However, for the first time here, we are going to see this contract created that puts requirements on both man and God. Now, of course, God is choosing to put these requirements on himself. He is flat out saying, this is what I am going to do for you. And based on that, he is putting some restrictions, or maybe some guidelines would be a better way of saying it, on how he is going to act toward these people as long as they hold up their end of the bargain. And of course, the same thing is true about man. God lays out some expectations, he lays out some behaviors, and he's going to tell them, these are the things you're going to get if you will follow the law and you will be obedient, but also these are the things that are going to happen if you don't do that. Okay? So both parties will agree to this covenant, to this relationship, and it is full of conditional promises. We don't see a ton of them here. More of the blessings and the cursing are repeated in more detail when you read the rereading of the law, the restatement of the covenant up in the book of Deuteronomy. There's also some mention of that in the book of Leviticus, but primarily there in Deuteronomy, I believe it's around chapter 19, 20, where we have the repeat of the law, where really those blessings and cursings are laid out. They're not spelled out in full here. But still, this being one of the key passages of the Old Testament, I do think it's important for us to read this together. And so if you'll follow along with me, there's not very many verses in chapter 24. I do want to go ahead and read chapter 24 in its entirety. Exodus chapter 24, beginning in verse 1. And again, I'm reading from the English Standard Version, ESV, if you want to follow along. Then he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come up to near the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do." And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men to the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all of these words." Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up. And they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction." So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up to the mountain of God, and he said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them." Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain, and the glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. This is a very interesting passage because it lays out the entire relationship between God and his special people that he has selected from all nations of the earth to be his special people, by which he will fulfill the original messianic promise in the garden, and also that fifth element of the promise to Abraham, that through Abraham, through these people, all nations of the earth would be blessed. It's interesting to look at exactly how this covenant is built and designed, and this chapter is laid out in the traditional way that agreements were made between people, between nations. Even today, many of these same patterns are followed. Let's look at what happened here. So first of all, we have to make the arrangements. So very similar to the time when God first came to Sinai, he's going to lay out what's going to happen here. The people are going to gather, and then Moses and Aaron and 70 of the elders are going to approach a little bit closer, and then Moses is going to go further up the mountain alone. We see this time he takes Joshua with him as his assistant. And it's interesting that when Moses lays this out to the people, they have to agree to this setting. And you think, why in the world would they need to agree just to the arrangements of who's going to stay at the bottom of the mountain, who's going to go up a little way, and then who's going to go the rest of the way? Well, if you would think about any kind of treaty that is signed or any kind of agreement, think about if the President of the United States is going to meet with the leader of any other country, there are weeks and weeks of negotiations of the arrangements. Where are we going to meet? Who's going to speak? Who's eligible to speak on the behalf of the United States? Who's eligible to speak on behalf of the other country? All of those things have to be agreed to ahead of time. Otherwise, the covenant or the agreement, the treaty that's going to be signed and ratified then is null and void because we didn't agree to the terms ahead of time. So that's what's happening here, is following the traditional pattern of any kind of covenant or treaty where before we can even meet to come face to face, we have to agree on the terms. So the people are agreeing here that they will come to the mountain, but they are not going to be the ones who are going to be actually signing the final agreement. They are not going to be the ones who are going to be the final representation. That is going to be Moses and Aaron and the 70 elders. And there's even going to be a point at which only Moses is allowed to go. And only Moses is allowed to speak on behalf of the people and then to turn around and to speak the words of God back to them. They have to agree to that. They are agreeing to the right of these elders to represent them and the right of Moses to represent them before God. Like any kind of covenant or treaty, we have to start on the paperwork. So Moses is going to begin here, and it says here that he writes down all that God had said. That is not just this last portion about who can come up the mountain and who can go up. This is, in fact, Moses writing down all of the laws that God has given them since they have been at Mount Sinai. And I'm even guessing although we're not told specifically, some of the things that God had told them along the way. Remember that as they stopped at different places, God had given them some rules and some laws even before they made it to Mount Sinai. All of that would have been included here in the covenant. And of course, we need to remember that it is way more than what we read in Exodus chapter 20 through 23. It's more than just the 10 Commandments and the various laws that we have presented. We talked about on Sunday how those are representational, how that they were examples, but there were probably many, many more laws that were written down. In fact, we have a more full account. Almost the entire book of Deuteronomy is a restating of the book of the law or the book of the covenant, which is what it's called here. So after Moses writes this all down, he calls it the book of the covenant, which later is going to simply become the law. This is therefore the final authority, the book on which this relationship is going to be built. Whoever agrees to this covenant is going to be bound and held by the words that are written inside of this book. Now we're going to have to meet somewhere. So Moses gets up and he creates the setting. He builds all of the elements. First, he builds an altar. That altar is going to be representing God. Of course, we know from chapter 20, verses 24 and 25, he built an altar of stones, an altar of earth, and that any stones that he was going to use were not to be hewn or touched with by any tool, just natural stones piled up to create the altar. And then it says here that he also creates pillars. These pillars are going to represent the people. And to further highlight that, he creates 12 pillars, one for each tribe. But when we say pillars, it's not what we would think of when we say pillar. If you said Moses created pillars, in your mind today, probably you're thinking some kind of very tall, concrete, round cylinder pillar that holds something up or something like that, okay? It's really not that. It's much more of a memorial marker, more along what we would consider today the idea of a headstone, a stone that is memorializing what either happened at that place or is representing someone. We carry that idea today very easily. That's the same thing that we found is actually the same word that is used in Genesis chapter 28 in verse 18 when Jacob, as we know, was dreaming and he was laying his head on a stone. When he wakes up from that dream, he takes that one stone that he was laying on, sets it up as a marker, same word, a pillar, pours oil on it, and consecrates it as a memorial of the things that had happened to him that night. It's the same thing here. Moses has built this altar. He's then gone and selected 12 stones that are going to represent the 12 tribes, and he has placed those stones up as markers, as pillars of this event. Then comes the sacrifice. This covenant is going to be sealed in blood. It's going to be sealed in a life, okay? We know here that it is both the blood of goats and calves, the blood from both burnt and peace offerings. The burnt would have been more of the goat or the sheep line, where the peace offering, it even says here, would have been of cows or calves. Likely, there was at least one, if not multiple, but very likely one of these offerings for every single one of the tribes, okay? That sacrifice is made, and then Moses gathers that blood, and what he's going to do is then seal this covenant in blood. And the first person that is going to be sealed is going to be God. So God is entering into this covenant, and he is actually the one who has put forward the words of the treaty. He is the one who has laid out the situation. He's laid out his responsibilities. He's laid out their responsibilities. He's laid out the blessings and the cursings, the punishments, the consequences, the benefits that they can get, all of those things. He is the originator of the document. So his words are the words that are in the book of the covenant. So now, whenever Moses takes that blood, and remember, he took half of the blood, meaning this is an equal partnership between God and the people, at least equal as far as they're both agreeing to this, I should say. And he applies that blood to the altar. The significance of this is that by allowing that to happen, God is agreeing that the covenant as presented is correct, and he will hold up his end of the deal. Of course, we know he is going to do that, whether it had been sealed in blood or not, but by being sealed in blood, as very common for covenants both of that time, and in fact as an example of our new covenant, that taking of the life gives extra meaning to the covenant here. Then one part of the relationship here has agreed and has been sealed. Just think about if we were signing a treaty today, the first person has signed. Now it's time for the second person to sign. And in this case, the second person is the entire people. So just to make sure that they know what they are agreeing to, it says that Moses reads all of the words again to them. Even though since they have come to Sinai, that's all we have done is given laws and read this back and forth between Moses and the people and God speaking directly from the mountain for the 10 Commandments. Still, he reads them again. There is no doubt this is what you are agreeing to. And of course, the people do agree. Very interesting phrase that they choose to use here. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. I wish they had been. But of course, we know they're not going to follow up on this. But they make this statement and they agree to this covenant. So the blood then is applied to the people. It says here that Moses read it to all the people and then he sprinkles the blood on the people. What is somewhat unclear here is, did he really sprinkle it on all of the people? Did he sprinkle it on those 12 markers that represented the people? Or did he just sprinkle it on the elders who were gathered as representation of the people? We're not really sure exactly. The language here is somewhat unclear. But either way, if it was applied to the stones, the pillars, to the elders, or literally to all of the people. Either way, this is the sealing of the people as a nation to God and to this covenant. It's interesting that was blood also applied to the book, this book of the covenant? It doesn't mention it here, but in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews gives us this insight in verses 18 through 20. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. Of course, the book of Hebrews comparing the first covenant to the second covenant, the new covenant, Moses, the first prophet, to Jesus, the second prophet, the sacrifices of the first covenant to Jesus as the great sacrifice, the priests of the old covenant to the new priest, high priest Jesus. This entire comparison is really what the book of Hebrews is about. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you. The people agreed, both God through the altar and the people have been sprinkled with the blood. They've been sealed to this covenant in blood. It's now a lifelong, everlasting covenant of blood here that is going to seal them together. Just like any other covenant or treaty, once that is sealed and everything is done, everybody's happy, we're clapping, we're standing up, and we're going to have a party. So there's going to be a celebration feast in recognition of the signing or the agreeing of this treaty. However, it's not going to be for all of the people, just for a representation. This seems to give more credence to the fact that the 70 elders, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, were the ones who had the blood sprinkled on them, and then they go partway up the mountain. And here we see it is Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders. It also seems, even though he's not specifically called out as going up, but it also is very likely that Joshua was there. We can't be sure that there's no time happens between these events here in verse 13, but it seems to be like they just happen in a row here. So Joshua, as a servant to Moses, was also there. And then we have this very strange scene for the feast. And the big question comes up, what did they see? So, what exactly did they see here? And the word says in Exodus chapter 24 and verse 10, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. So again, this question comes up, what exactly did they see? I'm a firm believer in reading the text and that God chose to tell us. He chose those words to be preserved for us because they have some meaning. What did they see? It says they saw God. Well, there's a lot of people who would question that, and a lot of people who would say, that this is really strange. It couldn't have been that they saw God. Well, why is that? Well, first and foremost, we're told many times that no one can actually see God or see the full glory of God and live. We're told, and I believe it's Timothy in the New Testament, that no one has seen God in his true form. So how can it be here in Exodus chapter 24 and verse 10 that Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders all saw God? Well, I think it's very clear, and I think for us to then say, you know what? They didn't see God, I think is to go against the text. They saw God, is what it says. Of course, many will specifically say that they did not, because the text doesn't specifically say they saw the form of God. Like we see in some of the visions where it'll say they saw God represented as a man, or they saw God on his throne. It doesn't specifically say here the elements of God that they saw. And many will point to Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 15, where Moses is talking to the people, and he says, therefore watch yourselves very carefully, since you saw no form on the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire. Well, that passage doesn't prove anything. That passage is talking about earlier in chapter 20, when God spoke from the fire to all of the people, they didn't see a form of God. They just saw the thunder and lightning and the fire on the top of the mountain. And that's what he's telling them here. Okay? He's not telling the entire people you didn't see a form of God when you went up to the mountain and had this celebratory feast. He's just talking about the entire people did not see a form of God at the top of the mountain here. And while it may not specifically say that they saw a form of God, there are some aspects of his appearance that are described. He was standing on a pavement of sapphire. Under his feet was the pavement of sapphire. Okay? And by the way, no, I don't know what that is. Some kind of representation of heaven that is so beautiful and clear and powerful and rich. And we could talk an entire class about what that might mean, and maybe we'll have time to do that in another class. But for now, the important part here is that God is represented on standing on this pavement. It talks about his feet. It talks about he had hands, which he did not use to touch them. And even, I believe, that it says, this text here, I believe, says that this form of God that they saw ate with them. Well, how could it happen that they saw God if no one can see God and live? Well, clearly, there is some aspect of God that looked like a man, at least from the standpoint of had feet, was standing on pavement, and had hands that they could see. So clearly, some aspect in some kind of human form exists that people are allowed to see and not die. And I believe that this was an aspect of God that could eat. If we look at in verse 11, where we continue that, and they beheld God and ate and drank. That is a representation of both parties coming together for this celebratory feast. And while it doesn't specifically, I know, say that God ate and drank here, the language, if you read it, is inclusive. Meaning they came together, they beheld God, and they ate, all of those who were present. Because of that, many people do believe that these are again clues that this may be Jesus, pre-incarnate Jesus, as that third aspect of God, that third member of the Godhead, who is doing his role in the Old Testament before he is going to come as the Son of God, born of a woman, Jesus. But still, the same personage who's doing there. And there are many clues that fit that, and we just don't have time to talk about that in its entirety here. So it is clear, though, that they saw some kind of separate aspect of God where they were able to see him and interact with him, but yet not die. And there's some interesting points here that this aspect is there with all of them. So they're at this place where they're eating and drinking and they're having this celebratory feast, and God is there with them, but yet it says God calls Moses from the mountain. So another aspect of God, separate from this one that is meeting with them here, is at the top of the mountain still and calls Moses away from this gathering to come up to meet him. Okay? So again, we have this strange scene. What did they see? Another question comes up, where were they and what did they eat? Remember, we had very explicit descriptions of how Moses had created the setting, how he created the altar, how they got the blood to seal it, how he wrote down all the words, but there's absolutely no mention of a feast being prepared. That, I believe, is because it was very common for in any kind of treaty or covenant that was signed at this time, for the more powerful one, the one who was presenting the terms of the arrangement that the other one has to agree to or not, that they would be the ones who would sponsor or would host the feast. So again, there's no mention that Moses prepared the place that they would eat or the meal. It seems to be, and there's some contextual argument here, that they ate at God's table. That's very common to be presented in Scripture, this idea that God is preparing for us a table where we will go and eat. And it also seems here that not only did God provide this meal, but also partook. So by the time we get about halfway through this chapter, we see now the covenant is complete. The settings were agreed to beforehand. The two people came together. The terms were read and ratified. A sacrifice sealing that covenant through death has been made. The blood of both of those sacrifices were applied to both parties, so they have both been sealed to this covenant in blood, and a celebratory feast has been presented and partaken of by both sides of the agreement. The covenant is now complete. This is a big deal. This is the first time that God has chosen a very specific nation and has given them the option. Here's all the things that I have done for you so far. Here's how I expect you to act to be my special people. And if you do that, here's what I'm going to continue to do for you, and the continued blessings that you will get if you will be my people. And he's presented them with the option. Now, I don't know who in the world would have refused this option, but the people had to agree to this. They were read the words, even a final time. I can't imagine how many times this is they've been heard that, but they've been told this, or they've heard the words read, but Moses again reads the entire book of the covenant. They agree to it, and it makes this very special relationship here between God and the children of Israel. Then to finish out this chapter, we don't have much time left, but to finish out this chapter, Moses is called up. Again, we already talked about that God calls Moses farther up the mountain, okay, where God is going to give Moses more instruction, and he's going to give him some tablets of stone. So Moses goes up. We already mentioned that he takes Joshua with him. Again, it is possible that this whole feast thing and the sealing of the covenant happened, that Moses and the 70 and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu, that they all went back down to be with the people, and Moses was called later, but that is not what the language seems to be. It seems to be very clear. All the people were gathered. The 70 elders, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu went up one place, and after that feast was over, Moses is called to leave that feast and go higher up the mountain. He does take Joshua with him as his assistant. Moses is not a young man by this time, but still he takes Joshua with him. And he leaves Aaron and Hur in charge and tells all the 70 elders, look, you have Aaron and Hur with you. If there's any kind of problem, you take it to them. I mean, after all, Aaron is a prophet, okay? And Hur, we believe to be Moses' actual father-in-law, the son of Jethro, who would have been a priest also. So leaving these two in charge, well, what can go wrong? Of course, that's what we'll talk about in two classes whenever we talk about the golden calf, obviously. So Moses goes up a portion of the mountain. He separates himself from the elders, and then he waits at that location where God told him to go for 6 full days. During these 6 days, the glory of the Lord comes and rests again on the top of the mountain, appearing as a cloud, a mist, it says there. So for 6 days, the Lord is working, doing something at the top of the mountain, whether it's preparing the tablets or whatever he is doing. He resides at the top of the mountain for 6 days, and then once his work is done, on the 7th day, he calls Moses to come up even further toward the top of the mountain. So, of course, Moses goes up higher, and then as we would leave chapter 24, and we see the covenant being complete, the feast is over, Moses is now going to get, he has written the words of the law, the book of the covenant on papyrus or some other kind of form. God is going to write it in stone. He is going up to get that. So God's presence changes from just a cloud to being viewed from the people below as fire, okay? At the entire top of the mountain, God's glory appears as fire. And then Moses, and we assume Joshua, although he's not mentioned here, they are going to go to the top of the mountain where they are going to stay for 40 days. On Sunday, then, we will pick up in chapter 25, where we will be talking about some of the special instructions for the tabernacle and for the priests. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed class. I didn't enjoy it as much speaking to an empty auditorium as much as when people can ask me questions and interact, but I'll be looking forward to that on Sunday. Thank you.